So I just wanted to say a quick thank you once again for everyone involved in the film. I think when you see the credits run, you can see just how many people it took to make that film, and to create such a moving and great piece that will really help raise awareness. So thank you everyone here today who's been involved. So this panel is going to build on some of the information and the topics that were introduced in the film. We'll dive into how FGMC intersects with the topics that we might already engage with on a daily basis, such as sexual health and reproductive rights. And at the end of the session, we'll have time for Q&A. I really encourage you all to take the time to ask some questions, because this is a really good opportunity to speak to some experts in the room. No pressure. Some of you already might be familiar with some of our panelists, but I'll just give you a brief introduction into who we have with us and what their background is. So firstly, Dr. Victoria Kinkaid. Victoria is a doctor with a strong commitment to women's health, whose academic work focuses on global health, gender-based violence, sexual and reproductive health, with her current research focusing on abortion care in the UK Armed Forces. She is passionate about turning research into meaningful practice and improving care for women and girls. Alongside this, she co-founded the FGM Education Project, an educational charity raising awareness of FGM in frontline professionals. So welcome, Victoria. Meena Ayittey, who is our film director. Meena is an award-winning London-based film director. Through writing and filmmaking, she has developed a strong passion for amplifying the voices of marginalised communities and those who often go unheard. This commitment has been a driving force behind her work, which explores subjects including domestic abuse, mental health, and race. Her recent documentary series, collaboration with Panasonic, focuses on dispelling the myths and stereotypes many African women face. Her 2020 Black Lives Matter film, Mama, made in response to the murder of George Floyd, earned several accolades, including nominations and awards from AICP, the Webbies, and 1.4, among others. So welcome, Meena. We also have Sean Callaghan with us on the panel. Sean is the head of research at Orchid project, where he leads efforts to document FGMC across its 92 countries of practice. He's undertaking his PhD in the School of Criminology at the University of Leicester, where he's exploring the impact of migration on the risk of FGMC. He also has over 30 years' experience working on social justice issues. I know you can't believe it either, as he only is 40. So welcome to all our wonderful panellists. So first, let's start with you, Victoria. So as we've just heard in the film, the definition of FGMC, I wondered if you could tell us what that looks like for a person who's experienced it.
Of course. So hello, everyone. Thank you for that lovely introduction. So as you might have saw on the screen, it was quite quick at the start, but the definition of FGMC is set by the World Health Organization. And at present, and it's debatable if it's the correct definition or not, but it's any removal of the female genitalia for non-medical reasons. And interestingly, it doesn't actually mention consent, so whether that was a consensual removal or not. And we could discuss that further in the Q&A. But what that looks like, well, firstly, there's 4 different types of FGM, so you may or may not know that. The third type is probably the type that if you are familiar with FGM, you kind of know it as, and that's the any narrowing of the vaginal opening. And I always find with this, and we'll hear about more later, but not a lot of people kind of understand the anatomy of the vulva. And I should have brought my vulva. Do you have a vulva with you? Oh! But damn, I missed an opportunity.
You can jump on the panel later for another demonstration.
But a lot of people kind of don't even understand what the vulva looks like, or even talk about the correct types. And we'll talk about them more later, I'm sure. With But in terms of the different types, so you've got type 1, which is partial or total removal of the clitoris, remembering that the clitoris only function in the body is sexual pleasure. So it's got 9,000 nerve endings, which is double that of the penis. If you saw there's a clitoris outside, what is actually cut is the glands. That's a tiny bit, and actually there's only been research done recently that's shown that it's actually like an iceberg. There's lots under the surface. So that's type 1, removal of the clitoris. Type 2 is anything that interacts or removes the lips of the vagina, so the labia. Type 3 is closure, any narrowing of the vaginal opening, and then type 4 is anything else, so burning, cutting, non-consensual piercing, and things like that. And what that actually looks like in practice is kind of divided into long-term and short-term consequences. Short-term is normally done without any anaesthetic, so it's obviously very, very painful. If we think 9,000 nerve endings on the clitoris, it's going to be a very, very painful, traumatic procedure. And if you think about, that's the kind of physical aspects, but how it's done in practice is often, a mother holding a child down, and the kind of psychological impacts that has as well. So that's psychological. We talk about as well the kind of acute short-term consequences like bleeding, infection. Often it's done with instruments that aren't clean. So there's those impacts. Then if we kind of go on to the long-term impacts, and these are probably the ones that people aren't as familiar with and don't think about as much, but you've removed the clitoris, which is impacted on sexual function and sexual pleasure. So a lot of the time, people who've experienced FGM will struggle with sexual pleasure, and we don't talk about that much in society because there's a stigma around female sexual pleasure, and I think it's always an important one to bring up when we talk about FGM is actually its impact on sexual pleasure. And oftentimes it's kind of seen in the medical profession as not that important, but it's massively important to both well-being and interactions with your partner. It's important for so many aspects of holistic care. So I really wanted to mention sexual function. There's other long-term consequences. Obviously, if you've had any narrowing of the vaginal opening, there's going to be issues with childbirth, even fertility. So it really intersects with all parts of a person or woman's life. And I guess there's a lot of conversations that could be had around the medical profession and how we talk about it, because oftentimes we're so focused on the kind of safeguarding aspects and the mandatory reporting that sometimes we forget about the patient who's there and the impacts that FGM has actually had on their life. And I think there's, with the work that we're doing, and I know a lot of other organisations are doing, is really trying to change that and to see all the impacts of FGM and how we can really address them appropriately. And I think I kind of went off topic with the question, but I hope that covers a little bit of the kind of real world impacts of FGM.
No, I think that was really great. And I think what is so important for our audience here today as well is maybe we might not all know that much about FGMC, but, we probably would talk with our friends about, sexual pleasure. We might talk about fertility. We might talk about childbirth, all those kind of things. And I really think that FGMC should also be one of those things that we feel comfortable talking with our friends about and interacting with, and kind of making it much more normalised to speak about, because I think that's one of the ways that's really going to help work towards ending FGMC, is for everyone to get comfortable with speaking about it. And, if everyone can just know one extra thing about it today, that would just be really amazing. So thank you so much for touching on some of those things. And my second question might maybe cover some of those things as well, but FGMC is often seen as a siloed issue, but it is a form of gender-based violence. It's a public health issue, and it intersects with many sexual health and reproductive rights-based issues. Through your experience as a doctor, could you please talk to us a bit about what you might have seen in those areas?
Yeah, and I guess we talk about it's a gender-based violence issue, but also oftentimes when FGM's carried out, the girl is between 2 and 15, so it's violence, it's child abuse as well, so it also impacts that kind of, it goes into that space as well. in terms of impacts, I guess, an interesting one to talk about, and I also think I'm stealing all your sandwiches, Annabelle, but is things like access to sexual health care. And I know we'll talk about this later, but things like if you've had FGM and, you know, you feel apprehensive about people potentially touching your vulva or doing intimate examinations, you're less likely to go for things like your routine smears. You're not going to feel comfortable getting antenatal care, and all these things are really essential for public health and for keeping people healthy. And I guess that's where it intersects with public health, because if you're not able to access these services because of both your own fear, but then also the layer of fear on top of that of, well, I'm going to see a doctor or a nurse who might not understand what FGM is, or if they do understand what FGM is, they'll want to talk to me further about FGM and raise a safeguarding concern around my child. And we see that being talked about a lot more now, where people are not accessing the care that they need or deserve because FGM is this issue that has been siloed. And as healthcare professionals, and that's the kind of group that I work with, we're so focused on the FGM that we forget the patient that's in front of us, and we forget the kind of unique health needs that they have because of what they've experienced, the violence against women that they've experienced. And I think we're good at delivering care to people who have had other forms of violence, but we probably aren't as good around FGM. And I wonder how that intersects with other issues like you've discussed, and how it kind of is it is definitely a reproductive rights issue, because I think a lot of people link it to religion, and like we saw in the documentary, it's not a religious practice. There's no religious document that says FGM has to be performed, and I think a lot of people shy away from the topic because they feel it is a religious issue and they can't talk about it. So from that sense, it's a massive public health issue, and it's one that we definitely, as you said, don't talk about enough. So yes, definitely a public health issue. There's definitely ways that people don't access care that have had FGM, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that in the next panel. So I'm sorry for stealing your sandwiches. But yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, definitely. And it's great to have panels that intersect anyway. People can feed off each other's comments, and I'm sure you'll build on what Victoria said as well. So thank you so much for that, Victoria. So Sean, we've just heard about FGMC and its relevance to other sexual health and reproductive rights issues that many of us engage with on a regular basis. I think it's also really important for us to contextualize that information in data and to understand what the data is telling us. And as the data expert in the room, my questions will now come to that. So how many women and girls are impacted in the UK, and where are they?
Yeah, let me zoom out a little bit. So on the film, 230 million women around the world living with FGM. That equates to 1 in 8. 1 in 8 women between the ages of 15 and 49 have FGM. 4 point something million girls every year are cut. 137,000 of those women and girls live in the UK. As the girl on the bus said, about half of them in London, the others in the bigger second cities, Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool, Leicester, Bristol. And I don't think it's really possible to find a postcode in the UK or a county in the UK that doesn't have at least a survivor. So it's not, it's not a London problem. It's something that's happening in the UK, but there's clearly these sort of epicenters. About half of the impacted community are either Somali or Nigerian, but again, the other half are from those other 92 countries that, again was mentioned. So again, we can very quickly stereotype, and I think that's the real message I want to give here is, yes, the numbers do point to certain certain places. Maybe one last interesting number to throw out. About 10% of the girls born in Southwark have a mum who has had FGM. Pass it back to you there.
No, well, sorry, I'm just feeling quite shocked by that number. That's a really, really high percentage. And I also just moved from Southwark as well. So, I think kind of the message is that FGMC is really relevant because you never know who around you has kind of been impacted by it. And that's why it's really important that we're all kind of part of the journey to end it. And can you tell us kind of how recent the data is in the UK that we have available?
Yeah, so the Parliamentary Committee for the Women and Equalities Select Committee in Parliament, they met in September last year looking at FGM, and they really took the government to task because the data is 15 years out of date. So that data that I gave you, those numbers I gave you, are based on the 2011 census. And they really begged the government to do some updated work to get to new numbers, at least based on the 2021 census, and then think about births and migration that's happened since then. Best guess, using some AI to look at those numbers in the last week, puts it at about 170,000. And some of us are now working on trying to actually get some real data out of that.
Yeah, and so it feels like that data was taken quite a long time ago and it's quite out of date. So can you briefly speak to us about the importance of having up-to-date data and what that means for ending FGMC?
Yeah, the point that Victoria made about providing services to survivors, protection to kids, where do you provide that if you don't know where these communities? If we wouldn't know the 10% in Southwark, we wouldn't know, we should do something in Southwark. So is that the data is at the heart of the entire thing. If we don't know where, how many, when, different ages of cutting, we haven't spoken about that, but if we don't know that data, we just simply don't know where to intervene. We know that it's the Somali community, so we have some senses of, okay, it's Brent and sort of northwest London, and we should do something there. We know it's the Nigerian community, so it's sort of Southwark and southeast London, we should do something there. Those communities cut at very different ages, sort of around 10, somewhere around 1. So, intervening at 5, you've missed this group. Intervening currently at Key Stage 3 in education, you've missed both groups. So, just having the data is really critical to all of that.
Yeah, no, that really makes sense. And I hope we are able to have some new data soon. No pressure on your contribution there, Sean. And so you've spoken a bit about this, I think, but how does growing up in the UK impact risk?
Yeah, so it has a massive impact. And, there's really two schools of thought, and they're both wrong. So one school of thought is that doesn't matter where you grew up, you're still at risk. If you're a Somali, you're 99% at risk no matter where you grew up in the world. If you're a Nigerian, you're 20% at risk no matter where you grew up in the world. The other school of thought is that you're not at risk. The moment you leave your country, you're not at risk anymore. And I think we can fall off the horse on both sides. The answer is somewhere in between 0 and 100. It's closer to 0 than it is to 100. So you're significantly less at risk growing up in the UK than you would have been growing up in Mogadishu, in the Somali community, or in Lagos. But you're not at 0% risk. And it's things like how sort of isolated are your family here? How plugged in are you to the sort of broader community, or not? What is the impact of your extended family having on you as a family? How much are you traveling back and forth to the country where your mum and dad grew up? where is faith happening and what role is faith playing in all of that? I mean, the interesting thing in the Nigerian case is most of the FGM is not happening in the northern states in the Islamic community. In Nigeria, it's happening in the southern states in the Christian community. So if we're going to do interventions in London and within the Nigerian community, we're really looking at the big black majority churches in southeast London, which again, it sort of messes with your mind a little bit. But so, thinking about, so there's so many different factors that are influencing it, but the vast the data all says that you're significantly less at risk, but you're not at 0% risk. And the fact that we've had court cases here tells us it's not zero, but the NHS data set will also tell you that it's not 100. So.
Yeah, and we have had some cases in the news kind of over the last couple of years that I'm sure people will have seen, but that is kind of a limited interaction with FGMC.
And I guess that's the problem around like frontline professionals with. So frontline professionals have a mandatory reporting duty to FGM if the child is, or if it's a child, and the kind of then the safeguarding intricacies around FGM. If a mother is cut, what's the risk of her having FGM performed on her children? And we're working in a system where we don't have the data. There's no clear risk stratification system, so we almost kind of the risk is we're working in this really risk averse scenario, which has its pros and cons, but you can see how we're kind of constrained by the lack of data. So I think there's real synergy in what you're saying. It's really important that we get this data and do it right.
Yeah, thank you. That really makes sense. And I'm going to move on to you now, Meena. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Thank you so much for our film. I think I can speak for everyone here in saying that was really great and really moving, and it will really stick with us when we leave today. So I just want to ask you a bit about the film and kind of your involvement with it. So kind of firstly, what initially drew you to making a film about FGMC, and can you tell us a bit about your vision and the story you wanted to create?
Of course. Hi everyone, thank you for having me here. So I think what intrigued me when the brief was first presented to me was that dichotomy between how shocking these statistics are and the fact that I knew and I know that this is something that we as a society need to speak about. I think that when it comes to FGMC, I think our almost initial reaction is to kind of turn away and hide from it because it is so shocking. You almost want to live in denial because you don't want to believe that this is happening. And it's happening, it's happening in the UK and it's so prevalent, and I think that I think that was something that I was very, very conscious of, and the fact that, it is so shocking that people might not want to engage with this. And luckily I had some incredible influencers who were able to come on board and help introduce this, the subject matter to a new audience. And what I really wanted to do was draw audiences in and pepper the facts throughout the film in a way that didn't alienate them and didn't feel too overwhelming, because you always run the risk of when it comes to topics that are so sensitive and also so shocking is people turning away, and that was something that I was very, very conscious of. I really wanted to draw people in with a story and almost not allow them to turn away.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it was so clever in the film. It was kind of how people would engage every day with different bits of information. So, you have to check what time the train is coming. So, of course, you look at the board, you kind of glaze up and you look at what adverts might be around. And so you're kind of engaging with it in so many different ways that you kind of get that message across of that you have to kind of engage with it, and you're naturally engaging with it as you would do with other things in your daily life. So I think that was really special how you managed to get that element in. And I guess as part of your journey of making the film, is there anything that you've learned about FGMC whilst working with Orchid Project that you'd like the audience to know?
I learned so much. I learned so much about FGMC throughout the process of making this film. I didn't realise that there were several different types of FGMC. I didn't realise how prevalent it was. I did have this misconception that there was a cultural and religious element. And, and this is me, someone who, I like to believe that I'm aware of, women's issues and women's reproductive issues. But, I had a lot of preconceptions that I had to unlearn. And that was very, very humbling. And I think perhaps one of the biggest challenges or, the biggest hurdles was just getting my head around not only the physical, but also the mental pain that survivors feel after undergoing FGMC. And I'm very aware of the fact that I come from a position of privilege and the fact that I will never know what it feels like. I will never know how horrific this is. I will never know, how heavy the psychological damage is. But I really wanted the film to, hopefully reflect the voices of people who are survivors of FGMC. And because many of those people cannot speak or do not feel as though they can speak for themselves. So, I really hope, my hope for this film is that, it does do justice to survivors. And, it goes a little way to kind of give people a voice who otherwise, perhaps would not have one.
Yeah, no, I think it was definitely really amazing how you kind of just adapted to everything we were kind of talking about. And obviously it's, it's a learning process for me with how the film works, and for you learning about FGMC and kind of all the sensitivities and everything. You just really took that on board, and I think that's reflected in the film. You can see it's done in a really sensitive way. And finally, I would just like to ask, what would your key takeaway for everyone here around the film be?
I think the key takeaway that, I'd like people to leave with is the fact that, we cannot turn a blind eye to this, because it is happening. It's happening around us. It's happening daily, and it's happening in these huge numbers. And I think, that we really need to remember that women's rights are human rights. Yeah. And I think that now more than ever, with everything that's going on in the world, we really need to be vocal about women's rights and female rights and human rights. I think that's something that we need to be very, very vocal and proactive about. And in addition, I think that we need to remember that we can make a difference. I think speaking on this panel, being here in this space is making a difference. I think speaking up if you feel that someone might be affected is making a difference. I think that speaking out if you're a survivor is making a difference. I think advocating for change is making a difference. And I think what I really want, I think, is for women and people to feel empowered and to know that, their voice matters and that we can make a difference and we can change things.
Yeah, and I think it's so amazing to have the film, because we wouldn't have had this event here today if we didn't have the film. And I think we kind of said earlier, engaging online with things is so amazing, but you also kind of briefly engage and then move on. But we're here now in this room speaking for quite a while about FGMC. You're kind of confronted with it and you can't kind of look away. You have to really engage with it and learn about it, and I think that's an amazing opportunity for us all to have here. So thank you so much for making that possible.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Yes. Sure. And I'd like to open the floor for any questions that anyone might have.
Thank you so much, first of all, for explaining what FGMC, is that how you say? Yes. FGMC is. Again, coming to this event, not knowing much about it, I will have what may seem like a dumb question, but if FGMC is not done for cultural reasons or reason of faith, why is it still done today?
Great question. I like to talk about it as 3 belief structures that are doing it. The one is about belonging. I belong to this community, I belong to this family. So in the Nigerian case, FGM happens as part of the naming ceremony. So when a baby is kind of like baptized, that where they get their name, they're also, FGM happens. And so it's this real marker of belonging. And if you think in Judaism, sort of 8th-day circumcision of a boy kind of really marks them as part of that community. Becoming a woman, becoming a wife, becoming an adult, And so in the Kenyan context, within the Maasai community, that it's very much a marker of becoming an adult. And girls who don't go through FGM often feel like they may be 30, 40 years old, but they still feel like a girl because they haven't become a woman. And then being holy, being pure, being chaste, being the good girl. And so those three things really interplay with each other and set up the sense of identity, that this is who I am, and this is a mark of who I am. And as much as it's, it's a child abuse and it's got all these consequences and it's horrific and it's gender-based violence, mums aren't doing it for those reasons. Mums are doing it for those reasons of this is the thing I'm giving my daughter. She's now becoming one of us, and so undoing that is so difficult because you have to undo that sense of belonging, undo that sense of identity that comes from that. And then replacing that with something else that still marks you as one of us, but not without this, and so that's the real hard work.
Can I jump in?
Oh.
Sorry. Also, I like to point out when we talk about FGM is so in the 18th century in Britain, we carried out clitoridectomies quite regularly to kind of control women, and it was done as a marker of these women who were masturbating. That was completely, that was a medical condition. Like if you were masturbating, you had something wrong with you, and they went to doctors and they got clitoridectomy, so their clitoris was removed with their consent, without their consent. Is it consent? Who knows? But this isn't just, I guess we sometimes don't see it as an issue that happens in the UK, and I kind of, we've all obviously heard that it is an issue that happens in the UK, but this kind of reinforces it, that it's an issue that it affects. It's all about control of women and violence against women, and it's all about control and limiting sexual pleasure. And I think a massive part of the kind of if you go to the root of why it's performed is to do with sexual pleasure and female sexual pleasure and female sexuality.
You can trust the man not to have mentioned patriarchy. Yeah.
Need to throw that in there.
No, that was a really great question. Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? Oh, yeah.
Can I ask something about the data? Obviously shocking that there's no new data since, is it 2011 you said? No. Yeah? That's a long time ago, obviously. Do you feel that there has been, and this is not to put anybody on the, what's the word I'm looking for? Responsible for that, but has there been and is there any improvement that way round? The reason I'm asking is obviously there's a lot of work to do to make people aware, to cope with the subject. And I'm speaking from the point I found it difficult as a teacher, and actually, Sean, I've just realised that's where I taught was Leicester. So there was a connection there. It was very difficult as teaching these 7-year-olds when it came, not the teaching, but when we had to deal with that, where what we were asked to do was just to look out for any change of behaviour. Obviously, we would do our best to report any change of behaviour and anything, but we could not actually go, obviously, to the family. We could not ask. We could not say, has anything happened in the way of? So, and I understand that. That's how the world works. But what really do you think there can be, as well as making aware? The question is, if I really wanted to make an improvement, what do you think practically you could do? I don't know if that's a rubbish question.
Might have an answer to that question, and she's not even on the panel.
Let me answer the first part of the question, and then I'll give it to somebody else for the second part. Is it getting better? That was the first part of your question. The vast majority of the 137,000 women who are in the UK with FGM were cut long before they migrated to the UK. So you know, very few of those are girls that were cut here. So, you know, is it getting better there? Yes and no. The target in the Sustainable Development Goals is to end FGM by 2030. We definitely won't hit that target. Some communities will get really, really, really close to that target. Other communities would have to speed up by 100 times a year in the drop between now and 2030 to get there. So, you know, we definitely aren't going to get there in most of the countries. But is it getting better? Yes. The general trend across pretty much all the countries is slowly downwards. But the slope is really the issue here. We have to speed up the change. I'll dodge the second half.
Well, sorry, can you repeat the second?
What can we do?
Oh, what can we do?
Yeah, because especially, and also, do you think it's important to look at what makes certain countries successful? And again, no reflection on anything, but do we look at, it's a bit like it's such a dooming subject, because for all the reasons that we all know, it's something that we don't want to talk about or face. And for me personally, I'm happy to talk about it. It's just so awful to think about it. That's the truth. The impact on those children, I mean, I sometimes cannot even imagine. So then you don't go there, if that makes sense. But we need to sometimes be very proactive in an active way, and think that every little could help. So what every little could I do, and what makes those countries that where the data might be showing that there's is that the right word, improvement? I don't know. It's a very, very difficult.
Yeah. No, and I think, I mean, I'm biased because I run a charity about education of frontline professionals, and I think education is power. We know that. We know that if we talk to people about FGM, if we educate them slightly more than they do understand, and if it's, especially if it's a topic that you kind of don't understand, you don't want to broach it. Whereas actually, if you have some education around it, if you have spoken to someone who knows a bit about the topic, you may feel more comfortable in breaching it and kind of talking about it within your community. So I really think education is really helpful in these circumstances, and we know that frontline professionals, despite having their mandatory reporting duties and all the responsibilities to safeguard, don't get adequate FGM education. And we find in research that we did in medical students that although medical students knew what FGM was on the kind of superficial level, they were really worried about the soft skills. So how would I talk to a patient with FGM? How would I bring it up? How would I identify someone who might be at risk? And it's those soft skills that we've really been focusing on, and probably aren't given enough time or consideration, because FGM sits in this wider bubble of stigmatized topics. You know, it's about the vulva, it's about women's health. It's not one of our sexy women's health topics that I talk about, like menopause or kind of periods, but not really. It's violence against women, and it's one of the topics that we don't like to talk about. So I think education, there has been a lot of good education initiatives. So I read a paper about Portugal who introduced an education initiative, and they've really found a kind of an increase in how they get reports, but also kind of, I mean, I think if it was just analysed further, they saw kind of a drop in behaviours around FGM. Whether that translated to a drop in actual FGM occurring, I think that's hard to measure. But my answer is education. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in.
The data says that the thing that works is not legislation, or it's having the long, hard conversations. That's ultimately the thing that works, and we see that everywhere in the world, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in Kenya, Somalia. It's just having those long, hard conversations. If you the Somali context is an interesting one, and I kind of tremble as I say this because I'm not Somali, but if you grow up in a community where everybody that you know has been cut, how would you know that this complication that you're having is a result of your cut? Because you don't know anybody that doesn't have this. Coming into a multicultural melting pot city like London, and you suddenly start to meet people that aren't having that, and you go like, well, why am I having that? You're not having that. Oh, maybe it's this thing. You know, that sort of light bulb moment is the thing that people consistently talk about as one of the drivers of change. And so it's about the medics having those conversations. It's about communities having those conversations. Ultimately, it's about having the conversation.
I think we've probably got time for one more question, or yeah. Oh, sorry. Oh, oh, we can have two questions. That's fine. We'll make an exception for you.
Thank you all so much. My question also has something to do with the data, not just the data in this country, but also worldwide, because a lot of it is estimated. Nothing is concrete, nothing is solid. Apart from, so we have the missing data, and as you've mentioned, you know, doctors feeling, or nurses or midwives feeling, you know, are they doing enough for survivors and the struggles that they face as well? And the fact that FGM since 2016 has risen by 15% to bring us to the total of 230 million women. I'm just curious as to your personal thoughts on why survivors are lacking services that are very, very important, you know, like the data for us is very important, knowing how many people have been subjected to FGM then can resolve, you know, how we can better support those women and protect their children. And also the lack of services in terms of reconstruction surgery, which, you know, there's a lot of advocacy out there for it, but it's almost like, to me, it's always felt as if the UK doesn't necessarily know what to do or how to handle survivors, you know, or how to even talk to them. And it just makes you think, you know, how do you speak to rape victims? How do you speak to domestic violence victims? Like, we are no different to those people. So I find it very strange that this, you know, not knowing how to address it or not knowing how to talk to survivors is very strange to me, but I've experienced it. You know, I'm a survivor myself. But why do you think these things or inconsistencies continue to happen? And we're in 2026. And it just feels as if maybe the reason why the slope isn't moving as fast as we want it to is because these things are holding us back. You know, not just the health professionals, but also survivors, their parents, the communities, etc. So I don't know if there was a question in there, but I hope I just want to truly understand from your perspective as a doctor, why are these things happening? I think I have a good idea as to why, but I would really be interested to hear your thoughts.
Thank you for that question. Thank you for sharing. I think from my perspective, I think you touched on it, it's education, and it's that the doctors and nurses and midwives not being properly educated around the topic and therefore shying away from these conversations. And
I mean, why are they not being educated on a topic when it's medical? You know,
yeah.
Like saying, oh, I don't know what a heart attack is.
Yeah.
I don't know how to deal with cancer. Or, you know, it's not a medical disease.
Yeah.
But, you know, like you said, doctors and midwives and nurses get the same PowerPoints or same generic information. I'm just wondering why that is. You know?
Yeah.
And you can cover it. Okay, that's absolutely fine. Because,
Yeah.
if you're a doctor, I can
Yeah. Yeah. And actually, I think there's, because you could, we need a deep dive into this. But thank you for the question. Let's bring it over to the next panel. Are you happy for that? Yeah. Yeah. It's a great question. We're not dodging. We're just
Sorry, I think we've got one final question here.
And I'm going to be very quickly, but I don't
Yeah.
think I need a microphone. I'm already loud enough. I have two questions, and you can both answer. The doctor in the house at this moment. My question to you is, what steps have you taken personally to make, as a professional health provider, either in your surgery, in your department, is there any steps you have taken to make survivors who walk through your door, you know, what can you do for them? Have you taken any steps? So that is one. I know it's deep. The other one is for Sean. And there are 29 countries in Africa alone that practice female genital mutilation or cutting, but also it's a worldwide. So we know Colombia is one of the highest in South America. And you mentioned quite a lot tonight about Somalia and Nigeria. Have you done any more studies here in London and other communities who practice? Because of the work I do, we have the Bahora women from India who practice female genital mutilation. We have the South American, and there's a lot of communities who live in London that who do practice, not just Somali and Nigerians. So my question to you is that have you done any more study within those community? And I think the last thing, it's not a question, is language really, really matters. When we are speaking and we mention certain communities, people tend to just look at those in those countries and forget about the rest. We know 70 million women and girls since 2015 has come forward from Malaysia and Indonesia alone. So this is not an African issue, it's a worldwide issue. And I would like to know what study we have done without mentioning other communities.
Shall I go first? Thank you so much for your question. So personally, in my role, we did the research to look at what medical students knew about FGM, because quite frankly, when I heard about the mandatory reporting duty that got introduced in 2016, I had gone through my medical training and I didn't. I knew what FGM was superficially, but I didn't feel equipped myself to be able to deal with a patient who was potentially at risk or a survivor. And that's why we conducted our research in the UK, looking at medical students' knowledge and experiences of FGM. And that's when we really found that medical students, although they may have known superficially about FGM, they actually wanted the softer skills to be able to talk to patients about FGM and also just to have those conversations really openly. And so from that research, I then set up the FGM Education Project, which has been running since we did the research, which was 2018. And we've just become a charity. So we provide education to frontline professionals on FGM. In my personal workplace, I work with the military. So I've been ensuring that all of our incoming doctors and medics have been getting FGM training. And we're about to write some policy around it, which is really exciting. And just kind of advocating for the topic. I think it's one of those topics that you bring up and people are like, oh, I don't really know what that is, so I don't really want to talk about it. And it's about talking about it more and more until people feel comfortable with the topic. So yes, I'm really glad you brought up Malaysia. I've been having some really interesting conversations with people who, so the most common type of FGM in Malaysia is type 1, or well, type 4 actually. It's any pricking of the clitoris, which is actually really difficult to identify on clinical examination, because if you think about the clitoris as kind of a nub, I call it, it's just being pricked when they were young children by a needle, which is type 4 FGM, but they may not remember it. And actually it's about talking about it. So it's talking about the vulva, talking about the clitoris, you know, all the amazing work that Dr. Sese does on talking about these parts, because otherwise we call them, it's down there, and, you know, no one really wants to talk about the clitoris. So yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you so much. And I'll pass over to Sean.
I mean, I knew Hoda was gonna, you know. Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. So this is the real problem with the current data in the UK is the ethnic origins of people in the 2011 census just didn't cover half of the places where FGM exists. So you know, you just don't know. They don't even show up in the data set. Never mind if you know that there's FGM there. The first European country to include Indonesia in their data set was the Germans, and it was the report that was published in December last year. That's the first time Indonesians have been included in any research in Europe. The study I did in the US and published 2 years ago included Indonesians, Malaysians, Kurds, the whole of the Middle East, the Bori community from India. So we really, you know, went outside of Africa, and on the sort of global numbers, about 60% of cases in the world are African, in those 29 African countries. 35% are Asian, with the two biggest pieces of Asia being Indonesia and Malaysia, but also Singapore, Brunei, India, Pakistan, Philippines, Thailand, and then about 5-6% in the Middle East, predominantly within the Kurdish community in Iraq and Iran, and then also into a lot of the Gulf states, Saudi, and so on. So and then of course Colombia in South America. And then we know about communities in the US that aren't immigrants that are cutting as well. So it is a global thing. It's not, you know, I'm a South African, and I really want to do a study on FGM in South Africa because I know it's happening in some of the indigenous communities in South Africa, and I know that there's a massive immigrant community in South Africa. So you know, that's not in the 90-something countries. That's another one that's not on the list yet. But you know, we this is a thing that we really need to think about, and your point that, you know, 100 years ago it was happening in the white community in London. So, you know, we need to really just think that this is not just an African thing. It's not just a Somali thing. Yes, the numbers skew in the 2011 data set to certain groups of people, but it really is a significantly bigger thing than that.
Thank you so much. I think that's all we've got time for on this panel, but thank you for everyone who's been on the panel. We're just going to have a really short break, 10 minutes, and then we'll meet back in here for the next panel. Thank you, everyone.